Hello, dear listeners. Welcome to the English Globe. We are so happy that you have joined us today for another educational and thought-provoking discussion. Our channel is here to help you not only improve your English listening skills, but also to explore some of the most important global topics shaping our world. Every time you listen, you learn new words, new expressions, and new ways of understanding the world around you.
That's right, Adam. And today we are diving into a topic that has been on the minds of millions of people around the world. It is a subject that appears in the news almost every day, and it raises big questions about the future of peace and security. The title of today's podcast is From Ukraine to Taiwan. Is World War III possible? It sounds dramatic, but we want to explore it in a calm, educational, and thoughtful way, so that our listeners can learn English and learn about the world at the same time.
Exactly, Julia. Now, some of you might be wondering why this topic is so important, and the answer is simple. Conflicts in places like Ukraine and tensions around Taiwan are not just local issues. They influence the entire world. They affect global trade, international politics, energy prices, and even the way countries cooperate with each other. For us as English learners, studying such topics is an opportunity to practice language while also becoming more informed global citizens.
We want you, our dear listeners, to remember that this podcast is not just about politics or history. It is about learning how to talk about serious issues in English. When you listen carefully, repeat new words, and reflect on the sentences we use, you are training your ears and your mind. And that is one of the most powerful ways to learn. This is why we always say that learning English is not only about grammar and vocabulary, but also about connecting with the world.
Before we go deeper into the discussion, we kindly ask you to support the English Globe. Please like this video if you find it interesting, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Subscribing helps us reach more learners around the world and gives you direct access to every new episode we publish. If you subscribe, you won't miss any of our future podcasts, and you will continue to grow step by step in your English learning journey.
Yes, and we also want to make this podcast interactive. That means we want to hear from you. Please write in the comments where you are listening from. Are you in Asia, in Europe, in Africa, in the Middle East, or maybe in North or South America? Tell us your country, tell us your city, and also share your opinion about today's topic. Do you think the world is becoming more dangerous, or do you believe that peace will continue? Your comments are very valuable, and they create a community of learners who learn from each other.
Sharing your thoughts in the comments is also a great exercise for your writing skills in English. Think of it as part of your homework. Instead of writing on paper, you can write here in our community. When you write, you practice forming sentences, using new vocabulary, and expressing your ideas clearly. And don't worry if you make mistakes. Mistakes are part of learning. Every time you write, you become better and stronger in English.
Now, dear listeners, let us explain why we chose today's topic. The world has always been shaped by conflicts and cooperation. When there is war in one region, the effects can be felt thousands of kilometers away. Prices in the market change, people move across borders, and international relationships are tested. The situation in Ukraine is one example. The rising tension around Taiwan is another. By studying these cases, we can understand not only politics, but also human behavior, culture, and communication.
This is very true, and we must also be careful here. We are not trying to predict or promote fear. Our goal is education. We want to look at history, geography, economics, and diplomacy, and then ask the question, is another world war possible in our time? This is a serious question, and one that many experts debate. But for us, as English learners, it is a way to practice listening, to improve vocabulary, and to engage with ideas that matter for every person on the planet.
In this podcast, Adam and I will guide you step by step. We will use clear language so that you can follow easily. Each sentence is designed to be educational, and we will explain complex ideas in a way that is not too difficult for beginner and intermediate learners. You will learn new terms such as global security, alliances, economic sanctions, and many others. These words will help you not only in English exams, but also in conversations about the world.
So, dear listeners, sit back, relax, and enjoy the journey with us. Remember to keep your notebook ready if you like writing down new vocabulary. Pause the podcast when you need to, repeat after us if you want to practice pronunciation, and take your time. Learning English is a marathon, not a sprint. Every time you listen, you get a little closer to fluency. And today, we are giving you a chance to connect your English learning with one of the most important global discussions of our time.
Before we can truly understand the question of whether a new world war is possible, we need to look back at history. History is like a mirror that shows us how nations behaved in the past and how they responded to challenges. If we know what happened before, we can better understand the present. So today, Adam and I will take you on a short but meaningful journey through the story of the two great world wars of the 20th century.
That's a very important point, Julia. Let us begin with the First World War, which is often called the Great War. It started in 1914 and ended in 1918, and it involved many of the most powerful countries of the time. The spark was the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria, but behind that single event were many years of rising tension, military alliances, and competition for colonies and influence. Nations were competing for power, and the smallest trigger started a chain reaction.
Yes, and once the war began, it spread across Europe and beyond. The main powers were divided into two groups: the Allies, which included countries like Britain, France, and later the United States, and the Central Powers, led by Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. Millions of soldiers fought in terrible conditions, especially in the trenches of Europe. Technology like machine guns, tanks, and chemical weapons made the war more deadly than any before it. By the time it ended in 1918, millions of lives had been lost.
The results of the First World War were devastating. Empires collapsed, such as the Ottoman Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Borders changed, economies suffered, and millions of families were destroyed. But the most important lesson is that the war did not really solve the problems that caused it. In fact, it created new problems, especially because of the Treaty of Versailles, which placed very heavy punishments on Germany. Many historians believe that this treaty planted the seeds for the Second World War, which began just 20 years later.
And that takes us to World War II, which started in 1939 and ended in 1945. This war was even larger and more destructive than the first. It began when Nazi Germany, under Adolf Hitler, invaded Poland. Soon after, many other nations became involved, and the conflict spread across Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Pacific. The Axis powers included Germany, Italy, and Japan, while the Allies included Britain, the Soviet Union, China, and later the United States. It became the most global conflict the world had ever seen.
The war was marked by incredible destruction and unimaginable human suffering. Entire cities were bombed, millions of soldiers and civilians lost their lives, and the Holocaust showed the world the terrible danger of hatred and discrimination. The war also ended with the use of nuclear weapons for the first and only time in history, when the United States dropped atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. This event not only ended the war, but also opened a new chapter in human history, where nuclear power became a central issue.
When we look at the outcome of World War II, we see that it completely reshaped the international system. The United Nations was created in 1945 to promote peace and cooperation among countries. the United States and the Soviet Union emerged as superpowers, and the Cold War began shortly after. Many countries gained independence in the years that followed, and the world order we live in today is still influenced by the results of that war. For English learners, these events are not just history, but also key vocabulary for understanding modern global politics.
So, what do these two world wars teach us? They teach us that wars usually do not start suddenly without reason. They are the result of many smaller tensions, mistakes, and misunderstandings that build up over time. They also teach us that once a war begins, it can quickly grow bigger and involve more countries than anyone first expected. In World War I, a small conflict in the Balkans grew into a global disaster. In World War II, one invasion turned into a worldwide struggle for survival.
Exactly, Adam. Another lesson is that wars always bring suffering to ordinary people. While politicians and generals make decisions, it is families, workers, students, and children who pay the highest price. This is why studying history is so important. If we know how much pain wars created in the past, we might be more motivated to prevent them in the future. For our listeners, learning these stories in English also gives you the power to join international conversations about peace and security.
And remember, listeners, history is not just about dates and battles. It is also about human choices. People made choices that led to peace, and people also made choices that led to war. This means that in today's world, our leaders and communities also face choices. Will they choose cooperation, or will they choose conflict? When you think about Ukraine or Taiwan today, remember that history shows us both the dangers of war and the possibility of peace.
So, by looking at World War I and World War II, we can see that the idea of a Third World War is not impossible, but it is something humanity should do everything to avoid. That is why discussions like today's podcast are so important. We are not here to spread fear, but to educate, to share knowledge, and to give English learners the chance to practice language that connects directly to real global issues. The more informed and thoughtful we are, the more we can contribute to peace in our own communities.
Now that we have looked at the history of the two world wars, it is time to move to one of the most important conflicts of our time, the war in Ukraine. This is not just a regional issue between two countries, but rather a conflict that has attracted the attention of the entire world because the outcomes affect politics, economics, and even the way nations interact with one another on a global stage.
That's right, Adam. To understand the conflict in Ukraine, we need to start with its geography and history. Ukraine is the second largest country in Europe, and it has always been a bridge between East and West. It shares borders with Russia on one side and with several European Union countries on the other. For centuries, Ukraine has been influenced by both European and Russian culture, and this position in the middle has often made it a key area of competition and interest for larger powers.
Ukraine became independent in 1991 after the collapse of the Soviet Union. For many Ukrainians, this independence was a chance to build a democratic state, connect with Europe, and develop a new national identity. However, for Russia, losing Ukraine was seen as losing an important part of its sphere of influence. Over the years, Ukraine has struggled between two directions. One path toward the West, especially the European Union and NATO, and another path toward closer ties with Russia.
The conflict that we see today has its roots in this struggle. One major turning point came in 2014, when Russia annexed Crimea, a peninsula in southern Ukraine. This action shocked the international community because it violated international law and changed borders by force. Since then, tensions between Russia and Ukraine have grown, and fighting broke out in the eastern part of Ukraine, in a region known as the Donbass. Thousands of people lost their lives, and many more were forced to leave their homes.
In 2022, the conflict reached a new level when Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. This event was one of the most dramatic moments in recent history. Cities were attacked, millions of refugees fled to other countries, and the world responded with strong sanctions against Russia. NATO countries provided support to Ukraine, both military and economic, while many nations across the globe debated how to respond. This is why the Ukraine conflict is seen as one of the biggest security crises since the Cold War.
For English learners, it is useful to understand the key vocabulary connected to this situation. Words like invasion, sovereignty, sanctions, and refugees are often used in the news. When you listen to international media in English, you will hear these terms repeatedly. Learning them will not only improve your language skills, but also allow you to understand international conversations more clearly and even to share your own opinions in English with people from other countries.
The role of NATO is also very important in this conflict. NATO, or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, is a military alliance of European and North American countries. Its purpose is to provide collective defense, meaning that if one member is attacked, all members agree to respond. Ukraine is not a member of NATO, but it has expressed interest in joining, and that is one of the reasons Russia has strongly opposed it. Russia sees NATO's presence near its borders as a threat to its security.
On the other hand, many Ukrainians see NATO and the European Union as symbols of protection and opportunity. For them, joining these organizations could mean safety from aggression, stronger economic development, and closer ties to democratic nations. This difference in perspective between Russia and Ukraine is one of the core issues behind the war. For learners, it is helpful to see how the same situation can be described in different ways depending on which side is speaking.
Beyond politics, the Ukraine conflict has had a major impact on the global economy. For example, Ukraine is known as one of the world's biggest suppliers of grain. When war interrupts farming and shipping, the prices of bread and other food products rise in many parts of the world. Energy markets have also been shaken because Russia is a major exporter of oil and natural gas. Sanctions and supply disruptions have led to higher prices, especially in Europe, where many countries depend on Russian energy.
This shows us how a conflict in one region can affect people far away. Even if you live on the other side of the planet, you might still feel the impact of the war when you go shopping or pay your electricity bill. This is why it is important for English learners to follow international news. By listening and reading in English, you not only improve your skills, but also understand why your own life might be connected to events happening thousands of kilometers away.
Another lesson from the Ukraine conflict is the power of unity and communication. The international community has been debating, negotiating, and cooperating in ways that show both the challenges and the possibilities of diplomacy. Countries do not always agree, but they continue to discuss and search for solutions. For learners of English, observing these diplomatic conversations can also help you see how language is used to build bridges or express disagreement in polite but firm ways.
So, when we look at Ukraine, we see a country caught between two powerful influences, struggling to protect its independence and identity. We see a conflict that affects not only its own citizens, but also the entire world through economics, security, and humanitarian issues. And we see a real example of why understanding history, geography, and international relations is necessary for anyone who wants to make sense of the future. This is why Ukraine is one of the core issues in today's global discussion.
Now that we have explored the conflict in Ukraine, it is time to turn our focus to another part of the world, one that many experts believe could be the center of the next big crisis. This place is Taiwan, a small island in East Asia, but one that carries enormous importance for global politics, security, and the economy. Even though Taiwan is small in size, the attention it receives on the world stage is as big as that of much larger countries. Yes, Julia. To understand Taiwan, we need to go back in history, Taiwan is an island located off the southeast coast of China. After the Chinese Civil War in 1949, the Communist Party established control over mainland China, while the defeated nationalist government retreated to Taiwan. Since then, Taiwan has developed as a separate political entity with its own government, economy, and society. But China has always claimed that Taiwan is part of its territory and should eventually reunite with the mainland.
This situation has created decades of tension. On one side, Taiwan sees itself as a vibrant democracy with freedom of speech, free elections, and a strong identity separate from China. On the other side, the government of China continues to insist that Taiwan is a part of its territory, even though it has never governed the island since 1949. This disagreement is not just a local issue, but one that affects the balance of power across the Asia-Pacific region and beyond.
The role of the United States is also very important in this situation. Officially, the U.S. does not recognize Taiwan as an independent country, but at the same time, it provides Taiwan with weapons, support, and a promise to help the island defend itself if necessary. This is known as strategic ambiguity, meaning the U.S. is not fully clear about how it would respond in case of conflict, but it signals strong enough support to discourage China from taking military action.
For English learners, it is useful to know words like sovereignty, recognition, diplomatic relations, and strategic ambiguity. These are not everyday words, but they are common in international discussions, and they help you understand how countries interact when the situation is not simple. Learning such vocabulary also allows you to read international news in English more effectively and to join conversations about world affairs with greater confidence.
Another reason Taiwan is so important is its economy. Taiwan is one of the world's leaders in technology, especially in the production of semiconductors, which are tiny chips used in everything from smartphones and computers to cars and medical equipment. The company TSMC, based in Taiwan, is the world's largest producer of advanced semiconductors. This means that if there is conflict in Taiwan, the impact would be felt everywhere, because the modern world depends on these chips.
Exactly, Adam. Imagine if production in Taiwan stopped because of war or political instability. The global supply chain would suffer greatly. Prices for electronics could rise, factories in many countries could stop working, and innovation in technology would slow down. This is why economists, business leaders, and governments all pay very close attention to Taiwan. The island may be small, but its influence on global trade and technology is extremely large.
Now, when we talk about Taiwan, we also have to think about the military side of the issue. China has built one of the largest and most advanced militaries in the world. Many experts believe that China could try to reunite Taiwan with the mainland by force one day, although this would be very risky. On the other hand, Taiwan has invested heavily in its own defense, and with the support of the United States and other partners, it hopes to deter any attempt at invasion.
And this brings us to why Taiwan is called a flashpoint. A flashpoint is a place where conflict could suddenly break out and draw in other countries. If China and Taiwan were to fight, the United States and its allies might become involved, and that could lead to a much larger conflict across the Pacific region. This is why many analysts compare Taiwan with Ukraine. Both are small territories, but they stand at the center of disputes between great powers, and their situations could influence the stability of the entire world.
For English learners, there is also a deeper lesson here. When we study Taiwan, we are not only learning about politics, but also about geography, economics, and culture. We see how a small island can become the focus of global attention, and we learn how language is used to describe such complex situations. By practicing with this kind of content, you are preparing yourself to understand and discuss important global issues in English, which is a skill that can be valuable for work, study, and international communication.
Another thing to consider is the perspective of ordinary people. Just like in Ukraine, It is not only politicians who are affected by these tensions, but also families, students, workers, and children. Many young people in Taiwan grow up knowing that their future is uncertain, and yet they continue to study, work, and build their lives. Their situation reminds us that behind every political issue, there are real human beings who deserve peace, stability, and opportunities to live full lives.
So, when we talk about Taiwan, we are really talking about three things at once: the history of its relationship with China, the economic importance of its technology, and the military and diplomatic tensions that surround it. These three factors make Taiwan one of the most sensitive and important issues in today's world. For learners, understanding this helps you see how one small place can have an enormous influence on the future of global security.
And that is why Taiwan is not just a local issue, but a global one. When leaders in Beijing, Washington, or Taipei make decisions, the effects are felt worldwide. This is why discussions about Taiwan are often described as discussions about the future of world peace. It is also why we include Taiwan in this podcast, because when we ask whether World War III is possible, Taiwan is one of the first places experts mention.
When we talk about the possibility of large-scale conflict, we cannot ignore the role of the major powers that shape our world. The United States has long been considered a global leader, with military bases spread across continents and a strong influence in international organizations. Its policies often reflect a combination of security interests, economic stability, and the defense of democratic values. In the context of Ukraine, the U.S. has supported Kyiv with both aid and political backing, while in the Asia-Pacific, it continues to maintain a significant military presence to reassure allies like Japan and South Korea.
Yes, and it's important for our listeners to see how these positions are not random. They are connected to a long history of strategy and alliances. The US plays a central role in NATO, an alliance created during the Cold War to counter Soviet influence. Even though the Cold War ended decades ago, NATO is still very active today, especially in Eastern Europe, where countries like Poland and the Baltic states look to the alliance for protection. This makes the situation in Ukraine not just a regional matter but a question of international security, because when NATO is involved, many nations automatically become part of the conversation.
Now let's bring Russia into the discussion. Russia sees itself as a major power, and it often views NATO's presence near its borders as a direct threat. From Moscow's perspective, the expansion of NATO eastward after the Cold War was a kind of betrayal, because there had been expectations of a new partnership in Europe. This is why Russia reacts so strongly to Ukraine's closeness with the West. For Russia, Ukraine is not just a neighbor, but a country tied by history, culture, and geography. By asserting its influence there, Russia believes it is protecting its sphere of influence and its security buffer against what it perceives as Western pressure.
That's true. And when we turn our attention to Asia, we must discuss China. China has been rising steadily as a global economic and military power, and its role in potential conflicts is growing. While Russia is often focused on Europe, China's main area of concern is the Asia-Pacific, particularly Taiwan. Beijing views Taiwan as part of its territory, and it has made clear that reunification is a priority, even though Taiwan functions as a self-governing democracy. For China, US involvement in the region and its military cooperation with countries like Japan and South Korea is seen as interference. This creates a delicate balance where any miscalculation could lead to confrontation.
What's fascinating is how the US, Russia, and China are all connected through different alliances and rivalries. For instance, while Russia and China often cooperate at the United Nations and share an interest in reducing US dominance, they are not always perfectly aligned. They have their own priorities, and sometimes their cooperation is more about convenience than true partnership. Meanwhile, the United States works with democratic allies across the world, from NATO members in Europe to Pacific partners like Australia, Japan, and South Korea. These overlapping networks make the world highly interconnected, but also more complicated when crises arise.
And then there's the European Union. The EU is not a single country, but together its members form a powerful economic and political bloc. The EU's interest in stability is clear. Wars and instability directly affect its economies, energy supplies, and security. For example, the conflict in Ukraine has had serious consequences for Europe's energy market, because many European countries were dependent on Russian oil and gas. The EU has responded with sanctions against Russia and increased support for Ukraine, showing that even though the EU often avoids military confrontation, it still plays a very significant role in shaping outcomes through economic and political power.
NATO, as you mentioned earlier, is central here. NATO is not just about Europe anymore. It has been building stronger ties with countries outside the region, like Japan, South Korea, and Australia. This shows how alliances are evolving to face new global challenges. NATO's strength is not only in military power, but also in its principle of collective defense, meaning that an attack on one member is considered an attack on all. This principle makes the stakes extremely high, because if a major conflict were to involve a NATO country, the entire alliance could be drawn in, potentially widening the conflict beyond one region.
Speaking of Asia, we should not overlook the roles of countries like Japan, India, and South Korea. Japan, for instance, has a pacifist constitution after World War II, but in recent years it has been increasing its defense budget and taking a more active role in regional security, partly in response to China's rise and North Korea's missile tests. South Korea, meanwhile, has its own unique challenges with North Korea, but also relies heavily on the US alliance to maintain stability. India is another fascinating case because it has historically been non-aligned but is now strengthening ties with the United States and other democracies, particularly through the Quad partnership, which includes Australia and Japan.
Yes, and these Asian countries remind us that the balance of power is no longer only between the US, Russia, and China. It's about networks of countries that share interests and values, and about how they cooperate or compete. India, for example, is cautious about taking sides but knows that a stable global order is essential for its own growth. Japan and South Korea want to avoid conflict but cannot ignore the risks in their neighborhood. These nations, along with others in Asia, play roles that could either reduce tensions through diplomacy or increase risks by joining new security arrangements.
So, when we ask if World War III is possible, part of the answer lies in how these alliances and powers interact. On one side, alliances create deterrence, meaning that potential aggressors know they will face many opponents, not just one. On the other side, alliances can also create risks, because a small incident involving one country can quickly involve many others. It's like a chain reaction, where one spark can ignite a much larger fire. This is why the balance of power matters so much. It is the invisible system that holds back large conflicts, or, if broken, could lead to escalation.
To sum up this section, the United States, Russia, and China are the main players, but they do not act alone. The European Union, NATO, and Asian countries like Japan, India, and South Korea all contribute to the global balance. Together, these actors create a system of interdependence, rivalry, and cooperation. Understanding their roles helps us see that the possibility of a global conflict is not simply about one country's actions, but about how multiple powers interact in a complex and often fragile balance. And for our listeners learning English, this shows how global politics is like a giant puzzle, with many pieces that need to be studied carefully. When we think about war, most people immediately picture soldiers, tanks, and battles, but behind every conflict, there is always an economic story. Because war is never only about territory or ideology, it is also about resources, money, and survival. And this is why the economics of war is such an important subject for us to explore today, since it helps us understand not only the costs of conflict, but also the potential benefits of peace and cooperation.
The first point we should highlight is the enormous cost of wars on national economies, because when a government decides to fight, it must pay for weapons, ammunition, transportation, and salaries of its soldiers. And this money often comes from taxes or borrowing, which means that instead of being used for schools, hospitals, and infrastructure, huge amounts are redirected to defense, and this can damage development for many years after the conflict has ended.
If we look at history, we can see how wars have left deep scars on economies, because destruction of factories, cities, and transport systems creates long periods of recovery. And this is not only true for the countries directly involved in the fighting, but also for their neighbors and even for regions far away, since modern economies are highly connected through trade and investment, which means one local war can cause global consequences in prices and markets.
Trade is one of the areas most directly affected by war, since when nations fight, trade routes can be blocked, shipping becomes more dangerous, and insurance costs rise, which makes goods more expensive for everyone, and sometimes entire industries suffer, because companies that depend on imported parts or raw materials cannot continue production, and consumers find themselves paying more for basic products like food, fuel, and clothing, creating widespread pressure.
Technology is another fascinating dimension, because war often accelerates the development of new technologies, as governments invest heavily in research for military purposes, and later some of these innovations enter civilian life. But we must not forget that this progress comes with an immense cost in human lives and economic damage, and in many cases it is not efficient, since resources that could have advanced peaceful technology are instead consumed by weapons programs.
Energy markets provide one of the clearest examples of how conflict can disrupt economies, because wars in regions rich in oil or gas often create shortages, price increases, and uncertainty that affects consumers all around the world. And when energy prices rise, the cost of producing and transporting goods also increases, which then creates inflation, meaning ordinary families pay more for electricity, heating, and transportation, making war's economic impact deeply personal.
Another important factor is sanctions, which are tools often used by countries or alliances to pressure governments without direct military conflict. And while sanctions can weaken the targeted economy by limiting access to trade, finance, and technology, they also have side effects for the countries imposing them, since businesses lose markets and supply chains are disrupted, meaning sanctions are a double-edged sword that requires careful calculation to be effective.
Defense spending itself is a subject of constant debate, because while governments argue it creates jobs in industries like weapons production, critics point out that these jobs are often less beneficial than those in education, healthcare, or renewable energy, since defense projects are usually limited to specialized companies and regions, and the overall economic benefit is lower than investing in peaceful industries that can improve quality of life for the whole population.
We should also think about global supply chains, because modern production is deeply interconnected, with parts for a single product often coming from many different countries, and war disrupts these delicate networks, causing shortages in industries like electronics, cars, or food, which shows us how fragile the global economy is and why even conflicts that happen far away can suddenly affect prices and availability of goods in completely different parts of the world.
This leads us to a hopeful lesson, which is that economic cooperation can be one of the strongest tools to prevent war, because when nations are linked by trade, investment, and shared projects, they have strong reasons to avoid conflict, since they would all lose financially. And this idea is sometimes called the theory of economic interdependence, which teaches us that peace is not only a moral goal, but also the best way to protect economic prosperity.
To conclude this section, we can say that the economics of war is a story of cost, disruption, and missed opportunities, but also a reminder that cooperation can create stability. And if leaders choose to invest in peaceful connections instead of weapons, the benefits are enormous, not only for governments but for ordinary citizens who want affordable food, stable jobs, and safe futures. And this is why economics should always be part of discussions about war and peace. When we think about wars in the past, we often imagine soldiers on battlefields, fighting face-to-face with guns, tanks, or aircraft. But today, the picture has changed dramatically, because modern warfare is no longer limited to traditional weapons or physical territories, and new technologies like cyber warfare, drones, and artificial intelligence are reshaping the way conflicts begin, unfold, and even end, creating both opportunities for defense and greater risks for escalation.
Cyber warfare is perhaps one of the most invisible yet powerful tools of modern conflict, since it does not rely on bombs or bullets but on computer networks, and attacks can target financial systems, communication platforms, energy grids, or even hospitals, disrupting daily life without a single soldier entering enemy territory. And because cyber attacks are often difficult to trace, they create uncertainty and mistrust, making them especially dangerous in today's interconnected world.
Another major development is the use of drones, which are unmanned aerial vehicles that can carry out surveillance or even launch attacks without putting a pilot at risk. And drones have changed strategies for both large and small powers because they are cheaper than traditional aircraft and can be used in situations where sending a human pilot would be too risky. But their use also raises serious ethical questions, since mistakes can cause civilian casualties and spark further conflict.
Artificial intelligence is also becoming a key element of modern defense systems, as AI can analyze enormous amounts of data much faster than humans, making it possible to detect threats, guide weapons, or even predict enemy movements. But while AI offers advantages, it also creates risks, because decisions made by algorithms may lack human judgment, and this could result in errors during tense situations, showing us that the benefits of technology must always be balanced with caution.
If we step back and compare today's conflicts with wars of the past, the differences are striking, because in World War I and World War II, battles were decided largely by physical force, industrial production, and manpower. While in modern wars, the focus is increasingly on intelligence, technology, and precision, and this shift means that smaller countries can now have greater influence if they develop advanced technologies, challenging the traditional dominance of larger militaries.
One of the most important aspects we cannot ignore is the presence of nuclear weapons, which continue to shape global politics even though they have not been used in conflict since 1945, because their sheer destructive power acts as a deterrent, meaning that countries are less likely to fight directly if there is a risk of nuclear escalation. And this uneasy balance of fear is sometimes called mutually assured destruction, a concept that has both prevented wars and created ongoing tension.
Nuclear weapons remind us that technology has two faces, since it can make war unthinkably destructive while also forcing nations to avoid direct confrontation. But at the same time, reliance on such weapons is dangerous because accidents, miscommunication, or technical errors could have catastrophic consequences, and therefore global treaties, negotiations, and monitoring systems are essential to ensure that these weapons remain tools of deterrence rather than instruments of actual destruction.
When we look at how technology makes war more dangerous, we see that speed and distance are no longer barriers. Since a cyber attack can reach across the globe in seconds, a drone can strike without warning, and AI can direct military responses almost instantly, which means conflicts can escalate faster than before. But at the same time, technology also offers opportunities to prevent war through better communication, surveillance, and international cooperation.
For example, advanced satellites and early warning systems can detect missile launches or unusual military movements, giving leaders more time to respond diplomatically rather than react in panic. And global communication platforms make it easier for governments and organizations to share information, reduce misunderstandings, and negotiate solutions. So in this way, technology can act as a stabilizing force when used wisely, even though the risks of misuse are always present.
To bring these ideas together, we can say that technology has transformed modern warfare into a complex system where cyber tools, drones, artificial intelligence, and nuclear weapons all play critical roles. And while these developments make war potentially more destructive, they also create new paths for prevention, reminding us that the key is not the technology itself, but the choices leaders make in how to use it, whether for building peace or escalating conflict.
So the lesson for us, and for our listeners learning English, is that technology is like a double-edged sword in global security, because it gives nations incredible power to protect themselves, but also increases the risks of mistakes, accidents, and escalation. And this means the responsibility lies not only in building advanced tools, but also in creating strong international rules, trust, and cooperation to ensure that these tools are used for safety rather than destruction. When we talk about war, it is easy to focus on strategies, weapons, and political decisions, but at the heart of every conflict lies the human experience, which is often full of pain, loss, and resilience. And that is why this section is so important, because behind every statistic, there are real people, families, and communities who suffer in ways that numbers cannot fully describe, reminding us that war is never just about borders or governments but about lives.
The suffering of civilians is perhaps the most visible and heartbreaking part of modern conflict, because ordinary people often become the first victims when bombs fall or when basic services collapse, and they face food shortages, lack of medical care, and the constant fear of violence, while children grow up in an atmosphere of trauma and parents struggle to provide safety. So the real cost of war is written in the silent suffering of people who never chose to fight.
Another dimension we must highlight is the refugee crisis that emerges from wars, since millions of people are often forced to leave their homes, crossing borders with almost nothing, hoping to find safety in neighboring countries. And this mass displacement creates enormous challenges for host nations, who must provide shelter, healthcare, and jobs, while the refugees themselves struggle with identity, uncertainty, and the emotional burden of losing their familiar lives.
Displacement also breaks the link between people and their homelands, because when entire communities leave villages or cities, culture and traditions often weaken. And this has long-term effects on societies, since languages may fade, art and music may be forgotten, and young generations may grow up disconnected from their cultural roots, meaning that the damage of war is not only physical but also spiritual, eroding the very identity of people and their heritage.
Education is another area where the impact of war is devastating, because schools are often destroyed, teachers are displaced, and children are denied the chance to learn, which limits their future opportunities. And without education, it becomes harder to rebuild after conflict, creating a cycle of poverty and instability. So we must remember that every classroom destroyed is more than just a building. It is a broken bridge to a better future for the next generation.
Beyond schools, war also affects language itself, as refugees adapt to new countries and often have to learn new tongues for survival, which can enrich their skills but also create distance from their native language. And when communities scatter across the world, small languages sometimes disappear, making global diversity poorer. So even the way people speak and express themselves carries the scars of war, showing how deeply human culture is tied to peace.
But amid all this suffering, it is also important to talk about resilience and hope, because history shows that even in the darkest times, people form peace movements, humanitarian groups, and community networks that fight not with weapons but with compassion, and they remind us that humanity has the ability to resist violence with kindness, building schools in refugee camps, delivering food, or organizing campaigns for peace, showing that human solidarity is powerful.
Humanitarian organizations like the Red Cross, UN agencies, or local charities play a vital role in this process, since they provide emergency relief, healthcare, education, and sometimes even mental health support for those traumatized by war. And while they cannot stop conflicts by themselves, their work keeps hope alive, giving survivors dignity and strength, which are essential for healing, and their actions remind us that compassion can be as influential as politics.
Peace movements also serve an educational role, because they teach societies that violence is not the only solution, and by promoting dialogue, negotiation, and respect, they inspire future generations to value cooperation over conflict. And while such movements may seem small compared to the machinery of war, their influence grows over time, shaping political culture and planting seeds of peace that may eventually prevent new wars from arising in the future.
To bring this section together, we should emphasize that the human side of war is not measured in weapons or strategies, but in the tears of families, the silence of empty schools, and the songs of cultures that risk being forgotten. And that is why peace is not only a political goal, but a human necessity, because protecting people from suffering, preserving traditions, and giving children hope are the highest responsibilities of our shared humanity.
So, for our listeners, the lesson here is clear. While leaders may argue about borders and power, the true story of war is written in the lives of ordinary people, and remembering their voices is essential if we want to build a better world, because every effort for peace, no matter how small, contributes to reducing suffering, preserving culture, and creating a future where humanity's brightest potential can shine without the shadow of violence. The question that often comes up when we talk about Ukraine, Taiwan, or other global hotspots is whether World War III is really possible. And this is a question that has been asked by politicians, experts, and ordinary people around the world, because the memory of the last world wars still shapes how societies think about global conflict. And while technology, alliances, and rivalries exist, many argue that conditions today make such a massive war less likely than before.
Experts often point out that one of the main reasons another world war is unlikely is the level of global interdependence we see today, because countries are not isolated the way they were in the early 20th century. And now economies are tied together by trade, finance, and communication, which means that a large-scale conflict would not only bring destruction, but also collapse the very systems that nations rely on for survival, making war against everyone else very costly.
Another important factor is nuclear deterrence, which we mentioned earlier when we discussed modern warfare, because while nuclear weapons are terrifying, they also create a powerful reason for countries to avoid direct war with one another, since the potential destruction is so catastrophic that leaders understand no one could truly win. And this awareness has been a silent but strong barrier against the outbreak of another global conflict for more than 70 years.
Diplomacy also plays a crucial role in preventing war, because today there are far more international organizations, treaties, and channels of communication than in the past, and the United Nations is one of the key platforms where countries can address disputes, even if it does not always solve conflicts completely, because simply having a space for dialogue reduces the chance of misunderstandings that could escalate into wider wars, making it a valuable safeguard.
In addition, modern societies are much more connected through culture, technology, and travel. And this means people from different countries often share values, ideas, and even friendships across borders, which makes it harder to see others only as enemies. And while differences remain, this human connection serves as an informal network of peace, because ordinary people understand that war would damage the world they all depend on for opportunity and progress.
Experts also note that governments today have access to advanced tools for negotiation and crisis management, and they know that even small miscalculations can lead to enormous risks. So leaders are under pressure from their citizens, economies, and international partners to find alternatives to direct war, and this pressure works as a kind of safety net, reminding decision-makers that war in the 21st century is not only destructive but politically and socially unsustainable.
Still, we cannot ignore that risks do exist, because regional conflicts, rising nationalism, or miscommunication between nuclear powers could create dangerous situations. And this is why prevention requires constant effort, since even though the chance of a full-scale world war is smaller today, it is never zero, and the global system depends on leaders, diplomats, and organizations continuing to engage in dialogue, reduce tensions, and search for common ground.
The role of diplomacy is especially important in this context, because dialogue allows leaders to understand the perspectives of their rivals, and understanding does not mean agreeing, but it creates space for compromise, which is often the only realistic path to peace. And history shows us that even during the Cold War, when the US and the Soviet Union were bitter rivals, communication and treaties prevented direct confrontation, proving that dialogue can work.
Another hopeful point is the growing role of international law and global norms, which shape how countries behave even during disagreements. Because there are now more agreements on human rights, trade rules, and conflict resolution. And while not every country always follows these rules perfectly, the existence of such frameworks gives the international community tools to pressure aggressors, encourage restraint, and maintain a system that discourages total war.
To bring these perspectives together, we can say that World War III is not inevitable. And while conflicts may occur in certain regions, the global system has many layers of protection, from economic interdependence to nuclear deterrence, from diplomacy to cultural exchange, and these factors make a global war less likely today. But prevention still requires active participation, because peace is not automatic. It is built every day through dialogue and cooperation.
So, for our listeners, the key message is that while the phrase World War III may appear in headlines, the reality is more complex, and experts generally believe it is less likely than many fear. But the responsibility falls on leaders and citizens alike to maintain peace, promote understanding, and support cooperation, because every conversation, treaty, or partnership that reduces tension is another step away from destruction and another step toward a safer shared future. As we reach the final part of our discussion, it is important to reflect on the insights we have gained from studying Ukraine and Taiwan, because these two case studies show us how local conflicts can have global significance, affecting economics, technology, diplomacy, and human lives, and understanding these examples allows students and listeners not only to follow the news, but also to analyze why international decisions matter, highlighting the interconnectedness of today's world.
For English learners, these discussions also provide an opportunity to learn useful vocabulary and expressions that are commonly used in global politics, such as sovereignty, deterrence, strategic ambiguity, sanctions, diplomatic channels, interdependence, and collective defense. And by practicing these terms in context, students can improve comprehension, speaking, and confidence when reading international news or participating in discussions about current events in English.
The Ukraine example teaches us about the costs of territorial conflicts, the role of alliances like NATO, and the impact of sanctions and economic interdependence, while Taiwan reminds us how technology, military presence, and regional cooperation shape potential flashpoints. And in both cases, we see that diplomacy, negotiation, and global awareness are essential to prevent escalation, making it clear that understanding the causes and consequences of conflicts is just as important as learning the vocabulary used to describe them.
We can also emphasize the human side of these conflicts, as we discussed in earlier sections, because behind every political decision are civilians who suffer displacement, loss, and disruption of education, culture, and daily life. And by combining this awareness with English learning, students can engage in meaningful conversations about human rights, humanitarian efforts, and peace building, using the language to express empathy, concern, and informed opinions about the world around them.
Another lesson is that global cooperation matters more than ever, and the United Nations, multilateral treaties, and dialogue between nations are key mechanisms to prevent conflicts from spreading, showing that alliances, partnerships, and diplomacy are not just abstract terms, but practical tools for maintaining stability, and knowing how to describe these ideas in English allows learners to communicate about important issues clearly, participate in debates, and write essays or reports on international topics with confidence.
English learners can also practice expressions like balance of power, mutual understanding, crisis management, economic interdependence, and peaceful resolution, because using these terms accurately helps students discuss global events with authority, read news articles more effectively, and understand expert analyses, which is exactly what we are doing in this podcast, providing context and examples that make both language and knowledge about world affairs accessible and practical.
Peace and dialogue emerge as central themes in both Ukraine and Taiwan cases, because while military power, alliances, and sanctions are part of international strategy, the ultimate prevention of war relies on communication, empathy, and cooperative problem-solving, and for English learners, this means that language itself becomes a tool for understanding, persuading, and engaging in discussions that promote stability and cooperation, showing that language learning is deeply connected to global citizenship.
Furthermore, students should notice how expressions like prevent escalation, humanitarian intervention, strategic cooperation, and diplomatic engagement are not just formal terms, but essential for describing how nations and leaders work to manage crises, and by learning these words and phrases, listeners can participate in classroom discussions, online forums, and even professional environments where English is used to describe world affairs, improving both comprehension and fluency.
To summarize our key insights, we have learned that modern conflicts are influenced by history, technology, alliances, economics, and human factors, that global cooperation and diplomacy remain powerful tools to prevent war, and that understanding vocabulary and expressions in English allows learners to interpret, explain, and engage with international news and debates effectively, showing that language and knowledge are inseparable when it comes to global awareness.
Finally, dear listeners, remember that learning English is not only about grammar and vocabulary, but also about expanding your understanding of the world. Because the more you know about international events, diplomacy, and human experiences, the more you can use your English skills to think critically, discuss intelligently, and make informed decisions. And this podcast demonstrates that combining language learning with real-world knowledge is one of the most effective ways to become both fluent and globally aware.
So, as we conclude, we encourage you to keep practicing English through listening, reading, and discussing important world topics to expand your vocabulary, and to stay curious about international events, because every time you learn a new word or expression, you gain the ability to understand, explain, and connect with the world. And in this way, English becomes not just a language, but a bridge to knowledge, empathy, and active participation in global affairs.